The mahogany conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights as Dad slid the inheritance documents toward my sister Sarah. $3 million, every penny of Grandma Helen's estate. My hands trembled as I watched 28 years of being the forgotten daughter crystallize into this moment. Sarah smirked, already planning her luxury purchases. Mom patted her golden child's shoulder while avoiding my devastated gaze. But then Grandpa Robert, who had been quietly observing from his wheelchair, slowly raised his weathered hand and spoke words that would shatter everything we thought we knew about our family. I should have seen this coming. Growing up as the overlooked daughter in the Matthews family meant learning early that love came with conditions I could never meet. While Sarah received piano lessons, dance classes, and private tutoring, I was told we couldn't afford such luxuries. When she wanted a car for her 16th birthday, Dad bought her a brand new Honda Civic. When I turned 16, they handed me bus fare and told me to get a job if I wanted transportation. College was the cruelest reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Sarah's tuition at State University was paid in full, her dorm room furnished with new everything, her meal plan upgraded to the premium option. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs to afford community college, sleeping 4 hours a night and surviving on ramen noodles and determination. When I finally transferred to finish my bachelor's degree, I graduated with $37,000 in student loan debt, while Sarah walked across the stage debt-free. The pattern continued into our adult lives. When Sarah decided to become a real estate agent, Dad co-signed her business loan, and Mom used her social connections to introduce her to potential clients. When I landed my first marketing coordinator position, they barely acknowledged the achievement. Sarah's first home purchase was celebrated with a family party and a $5,000 housewarming gift from our parents. When I finally saved enough for a small apartment deposit, Mom remarked that I was finally learning to be responsible. Grandma Helen had always been different. She treated both granddaughters equally, remembering our birthdays with thoughtful gifts, asking about our jobs and relationships with genuine interest. Her catering business, Helen's Kitchen, had grown from a small operation in her home to a successful company serving corporate events and weddings throughout the county. She often told us stories about building something from nothing, about the importance of hard work and treating people fairly. When Grandma Helen suffered a massive stroke 6 months ago, our family dynamic shifted dramatically. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one who called out unfairness when she saw it. Without her gentle but firm presence, Mom and Dad's favoritism toward Sarah became even more blatant. During Helen's final weeks, Sarah visited once while I spent every evening at the hospital reading to my grandmother and holding her hand as machines kept her breathing. The day Helen passed away, I grieved not just for my grandmother, but for the loss of the only person in my family who had truly seen and valued me. She had whispered something to me the night before she died, but her words were too faint to understand. I assumed she was saying goodbye, telling me she loved me. I never imagined she was trying to warn me about what was coming. The inheritance meeting was scheduled for a cold Tuesday morning in February. Dad, as the estate executor, had arranged for us to meet at the law offices of Davidson and Associates downtown. The building was one of those imposing glass structures that made you feel small just walking through the lobby. Mr. Davidson, a middle-aged man with silver hair and an expensive suit, led us to a conference room that smelled of leather and wood polish. Grandpa Robert arrived last, struggling with his wheelchair and seeming more frail than I remembered. At 82 years old, he had been Helen's devoted husband for 52 years. Since her death, he had withdrawn into himself, speaking little and moving slowly. I helped him position his wheelchair at the table, noticing how his hands shook as he arranged a manila folder in his lap. Dad cleared his throat and began speaking in the businesslike tone he used when discussing finances. He explained that Grandma Helen's estate, including the catering business, her house, and various investments, was valued at approximately $3 million. My heart raced with hope that maybe finally I would receive some recognition, some sign that my grandmother had seen how hard I tried to be a good daughter and granddaughter. Then Dad opened the will and began reading. Sarah would receive the entire inheritance. The house, the business, the investment accounts, everything. The only explanation provided was that Sarah had demonstrated superior financial planning and life management skills. I was mentioned briefly with a recommendation that I continue working hard to develop the same responsible habits that lead to success. The words hit me like physical blows. Superior financial planning. Sarah had never managed anything more complex than a checkbook, and even that was questionable given how often she had asked our parents for temporary loans that were never repaid. Life management skills. She had changed jobs 6 times in the past 3 years, each time blaming her departure on personality conflicts with supervisors who didn't understand her potential. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. She didn't express surprise or gratitude. Instead, she smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been met perfectly. She had known this was coming. Mom squeezed her shoulder proudly while Dad beamed at his successful daughter. Neither of them looked at me. That's when Grandpa Robert lifted his trembling hand and spoke in a voice stronger than I had heard from him in months. Thomas, I think everyone needs to wait just a moment. There are some things about your mother's real wishes that we need to discuss before anything becomes final. Dad's face flushed red as he turned toward Grandpa Robert with barely contained irritation. Dad, I appreciate your grief, but the will is legally binding and witnessed properly. We've already discussed this with Mr. Davidson. There's nothing to debate here. Mom leaned forward, her voice dripping with fake concern. Robert, we know this is difficult for you, but Helen made her wishes very clear. Sarah has always been more responsible with money, and Helen wanted to make sure the inheritance went to someone who would use it wisely. The casual cruelty of her words made my stomach churn. More responsible with money, Sarah had declared bankruptcy at 25 after maxing out 7 credit cards on designer clothes and luxury vacations. Our parents had quietly paid off her debts to protect the family reputation. Meanwhile, I had been saving money since I was 14, never asking for financial help, always living within my means. Sarah finally spoke, and her words cut deeper than I thought possible. Ava, maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. You've always complained about not having opportunities, but maybe you just need to work harder, like successful people do. I mean, I've built my real estate career from nothing, right? Mom, she hadn't built anything from nothing. Dad had given her $50,000 to start her real estate career, and Mom had introduced her to every wealthy family in their social circle. But pointing this out would only make me look bitter and jealous, which is exactly how they wanted me to appear. Look, Sarah continued with mock sympathy, if you really need money, I could loan you some at a reasonable interest rate, maybe 10%. That's better than what banks charge for personal loans. You could use it to go back to school or start a business or something. 10% interest. She was offering to loan me money from what should have been my inheritance at rates that would keep me indebted to her for years. The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Instead, I focused on the memories flooding back. Every birthday party where Sarah received expensive gifts while I got generic cards with $20 bills. Every family vacation where Sarah's preferences determined our destination, while my suggestions were dismissed as unrealistic. Every achievement of mine that was met with polite acknowledgement, while Sarah's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like Nobel Prize victories. I thought about the night I had called them excited to share news about a promotion at work. Mom had cut me off after 30 seconds to tell me about Sarah's new listing for $1 million house. I remembered the Christmas when I had saved for months to buy thoughtful gifts for everyone, only to watch Sarah show up empty-handed because she had forgotten to go shopping, but still received just as much attention and affection. The worst memory was from 5 years ago when I had been laid off and struggled to make rent. I had swallowed my pride and asked Dad for a small loan to help me through a rough month. He had lectured me about financial responsibility and suggested I move to a cheaper apartment. 2 weeks later, Sarah had mentioned casually that Dad had given her $5,000 to redecorate her living room because she deserved something nice. But Grandpa Robert wasn't backing down. Despite his frail appearance, his voice grew steadier as he spoke. "Thomas, you're wrong about Helen's wishes. She talked to me extensively about her concerns regarding this inheritance, and she made preparations." "What kind of preparations?" Mr. Davidson asked, his professional curiosity overriding the family drama. Grandpa Robert struggled to open the manila folder in his lap, his arthritic fingers working slowly at the clasp. Helen knew there might be people who would try to manipulate this situation for their own benefit. She was much more aware of what was happening in this family than anyone realized. Mom's voice sharpened. "Robert, that's ridiculous. Helen never said anything to us about concerns or preparations. She was grateful that Thomas was handling her affairs because her mind wasn't as sharp toward the end." "Her mind was perfectly sharp," Grandpa Robert said firmly. "Sharp enough to install recording equipment in her house when she started noticing strange things happening. Sharp enough to document conversations that revealed the true motivations of certain family members. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dad went very still while Mom's face drained of color. Sarah stopped smirking for the first time since we had arrived. "That's impossible," Dad said slowly. "There was no recording equipment." Grandpa Robert pulled an old smartphone from his folder, one I recognized as belonging to Grandma Helen. She recorded dozens of conversations over the past 2 years, conversations where Thomas and Patricia discussed their plans for handling the inheritance, conversations where they laughed about Ava being too naive to fight back, conversations where they promised Sarah the entire estate in exchange for her agreement to fund their retirement. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the hum of the air conditioning system, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Mr. Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while the family I had known my entire life revealed themselves to be strangers. "You can't have recorded us without our permission?" Mom said, her voice rising to a pitch that made her sound desperate. "That's illegal. Those recordings can't be used for anything." "Actually," Mr. Davidson interjected carefully, "in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. If Mrs. Matthews was recording conversations in her own home with her own equipment, those recordings would be legally admissible in most circumstances." Grandpa Robert's finger hovered over the play button on the phone. "Would you like to hear what your mother really thought about this inheritance plan, about what she discovered regarding Sarah's financial situation, about what she learned concerning Thomas's access to her business accounts?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. Whatever was on that phone, it was devastating enough to make my father, mother, and sister look genuinely afraid for the first time in my life. And I realized that my quiet, grieving grandfather had been anything but passive during these past months. He had been gathering ammunition. Grandpa Robert's finger pressed the play button, and suddenly Grandma Helen's voice filled the conference room. Her tone was strong and clear, nothing like the frail woman I had visited in the hospital. The recording was from 8 months ago before her stroke, when her mind was sharp and her instincts were telling her something was wrong. "I don't understand why Thomas keeps asking about my bank account numbers," Helen's voice said. "And Patricia has been very interested in my jewelry collection lately, asking if I've had it appraised recently." Then came Dad's voice, unmistakably his, though I had never heard him speak with such cold calculation. "Mom, we're just trying to help you organize your affairs. Sarah has some experience with financial planning from her real estate work. She could help manage your investments more effectively." "What about Ava?" Helen asked. "She's always been so responsible with money." Mom's laughter on the recording was harsh and dismissive. "Ava Robert, honestly, that girl has never understood how money works. She's too emotional, too impractical. Sarah understands business, understands networking, understands how to make money grow. Ava would probably just put everything in a savings account and call it financial planning." The words hit me like physical slaps. Too emotional, too impractical. I had been managing my own finances successfully since I was 18, had never asked them for money, had built a small but steady savings account, despite earning less than half of what Sarah made with their support. The recording continued, and I heard Sarah's voice joining the conversation. "Grandma Helen, I've been thinking about expanding my real estate business. If I had access to more capital, I could really make something significant happen. Something that would benefit the whole family." "What kind of capital?" Helen asked. "Well," Sarah said, her tone carefully casual, "if I could access some of your assets as collateral, I could secure larger commercial loans. We could turn your $3 million into $10 million within a few years. Ava could never handle that kind of sophisticated financial planning." $3 million. At that time, I had assumed Helen's estate was worth maybe $500,000. She had always lived modestly, and while her catering business was successful, I had never imagined she had accumulated that much wealth. Grandpa Robert paused the recording and looked directly at my parents. "That was just one conversation. There are many more. Would you like to hear the one where Patricia suggests donating Helen's antique furniture to charity rather than leaving it to Ava? Or perhaps the recording where Thomas discusses transferring funds from Helen's business account to cover Sarah's gambling debts?" Gambling debts. Sarah didn't gamble. She had never shown any interest in casinos or sports betting. But then I remembered all those weekend trips to Atlantic City she had taken over the past year, all those girls' weekends that she had been oddly secretive about. Dad's face was now completely white. "Those recordings are taken out of context. We were having theoretical discussions about estate planning options, nothing more." "Theoretical." Grandpa Robert pulled out a stack of papers. Were these bank statements theoretical too? The ones showing that $47,000 had been transferred from Helen's business account to an account belonging to Sarah Transfers that happened while Helen was in the intensive care unit, unable to authorize any financial transactions? Mr. Davidson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Matthews, these are allegations of potential financial crimes. If there's evidence of unauthorized access to your mother's accounts—" "There's no evidence of anything criminal," Mom interjected desperately. "Helen gave us power of attorney to handle her affairs when she became ill. Everything we did was legally authorized." But I saw the panic in her eyes, heard the tremor in her voice. She was lying, and everyone in the room knew it. Grandpa Robert had caught them stealing from a dying woman, and now they were scrambling to avoid the consequences. Sarah tried a different approach, turning to me with crocodile tears forming in her eyes. "Ava, I can't believe Grandpa is trying to turn our family against each other like this." Don't you think we should be supporting each other during this difficult time instead of making accusations and causing drama? The manipulation was so obvious, so calculated, that I almost laughed. For 28 years, I had fallen for this routine. Sarah would do something hurtful or selfish, then reframe the situation to make herself the victim and me the unreasonable one. But sitting in that conference room listening to recorded evidence of their betrayal, I finally saw her tactics clearly. "Support each other," I said quietly. "You mean the way you supported me when I was working 3 jobs to pay for college, or the way you supported me when I was struggling after being laid off? That kind of family support." Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw pure hatred flash across her face before she composed herself again. "Ava, you've always been so negative, so focused on what you think you deserve instead of what you can earn. Maybe if you had Sarah's positive attitude and work ethic, your life would be different." Work ethic. I had been working since I was 14 years old. Sarah had never held a job that wasn't arranged by our parents until she was 26. But they had rewritten history so completely that they actually believed their own lies. Grandpa Robert played another recording, this one more recent. Helen's voice was weaker but still determined. "Robert, I need you to understand something very important. I've been watching this family carefully since I became sick, and I've seen things that broke my heart. Thomas and Patricia have been stealing from me, and they've been planning to exclude Ava from the inheritance entirely." "Are you certain?" Grandpa's voice on the recording asked. "I hired a private investigator," Helen replied. "What I discovered was worse than I imagined. Not only have they been taking money from my accounts, but Sarah has been forging my signature on documents. She's used my name and credit to secure business loans that she can't repay. If something happens to me, all of that debt will fall on my estate, and Ava will end up with nothing while Sarah walks away clean." The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's sharp intake of breath. She looked like she was going to be sick, and Mom was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. "Furthermore," Helen's voice continued, "I want you to know that my real will, my actual final wishes, are in our safety deposit box at First National Bank. The will that Thomas has been working with is outdated by over a year. Everything needs to go to Ava, along with documentation about what the others have done. She's the only one who can be trusted to handle my affairs honorably." Grandpa Robert stopped the recording and looked around the table. "The private investigator's report makes for very interesting reading. Thomas, did you think your mother wouldn't notice when you started skimming money from the catering business to cover Sarah's debts? Patricia, did you believe she wouldn't realize you were selling her jewelry and antiques piece by piece? I felt like I was watching strangers. These people I had called family for my entire life were thieves and manipulators, and they had been stealing from a dying woman while making me feel guilty for expecting basic fairness and love." But Grandpa Robert wasn't finished. He struggled to stand up from his wheelchair, moving more steadily than I had seen him move in months. "There's something else everyone in this room needs to understand. I haven't been as helpless as I've let you believe. Helen and I planned this entire confrontation very carefully. We knew this day would come, and we prepared for it." As he stood there, no longer seeming frail or confused, I realized that my grandfather had been acting. He had been playing the role of the grieving, diminished widower while secretly documenting everything and preparing to protect me from the family I had never realized was my enemy. The man I thought I knew had been busy seeking justice for the granddaughter who had always been overlooked, and his transformation from helpless victim to determined protector was about to change everything. Standing straighter than I had seen him since before Grandma Helen's stroke, Grandpa Robert reached into his folder and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. Helen spent the last year of her life investigating her own family because she suspected something was wrong. What she discovered was worse than either of us had imagined. Mr. Davidson watched with professional fascination as Grandpa Robert broke the wax seal and spread documents across the mahogany table. Mrs. Matthews hired Blackstone Investigations, one of the most reputable private investigation firms in the state. Their report is quite comprehensive. Dad's voice was barely a whisper. That's impossible. Mom never mentioned anything about investigators. Your mother was many things, Thomas, but naive wasn't one of them, Grandpa Robert replied. She built a successful business by understanding people and recognizing when someone was trying to deceive her. When money started disappearing from her accounts and you became unusually interested in her financial affairs, she knew something was wrong. He handed the first document to Mr. Davidson, who began reading with increasing alarm. This report documents systematic theft from Mrs. Helen Matthews' business accounts over a period of 18 months. The total amount appears to be $87,000. Sarah jumped to her feet, her composure finally cracking completely. That's a lie. I never stole anything. Those were authorized transfers for business expenses. Business expenses. Grandpa Robert pulled out another set of papers. According to this casino credit report, you accumulated over $60,000 in gambling debts at 3 different casinos in Atlantic City. The investigation also revealed that you've been lying about your real estate income for the past 2 years. I watched my sister's face cycle through emotions, denial, anger, fear, and finally desperate calculation. She had always been a good actress, but the evidence was too overwhelming for even her practiced manipulation to overcome. Furthermore, Grandpa Robert continued, the investigator discovered that Sarah has been operating a fraudulent scheme involving fake real estate listings. She's been collecting deposits from potential buyers for properties she doesn't actually have the authority to sell. Mr. Davidson looked up from the documents, his expression grave. These are serious criminal allegations. If this evidence is accurate, we're talking about wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Mom found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Robert, please, we're family. Surely we can work this out privately without involving lawyers and investigators and making everything so complicated. Privately, I spoke for the first time since the recordings began. The way you privately decided to steal my inheritance, the way you privately planned to exclude me from my own grandmother's will, that kind of private family business, the look Mom gave me was pure venom. For a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw exactly what she thought of me. Not disappointment or concern, but actual hatred. She resented my existence, resented that she had to share her husband's attention and resources with a daughter she had never wanted. Grandpa Robert handed another document to Mr. Davidson. This is the investigator's report on Patricia's activities. She's been systematically stealing and selling Helen's valuable possessions for the past year. What possessions? Dad asked weakly. Helen's grandmother's ring collection worth approximately $32,000. Her silver tea service valued at $18,000. 3 oil paintings by local artists that have appreciated significantly in value. Patricia has been selling them piece by piece and keeping the money. I remembered those paintings. They had hung in Grandma Helen's living room for as long as I could remember, beautiful landscapes that she had purchased from struggling artists decades ago to help support their work. She had always said they reminded her of the places she wanted to travel to someday. And Thomas. Grandpa Robert turned to my father with disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. You've been the worst of all. You've been using your power of attorney to transfer money from your mother's business accounts to cover your gambling losses and bad investments. Gambling losses. I stared at Dad in shock. You don't gamble. Online poker, Grandpa Robert said sadly. According to the investigation, he's lost over $100,000 in the past 2 years playing high-stakes poker games online. He's also made several extremely poor stock investments using Helen's money without her knowledge or consent. The picture was becoming clear. My parents and sister hadn't just been favoring Sarah over me, they had been actively stealing from my grandmother to fund their various addictions and schemes. And when Helen became ill, they saw an opportunity to cover their tracks by manipulating the inheritance. The investigator also discovered something else interesting. Grandpa Robert said, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. Sarah's real estate license has been suspended for ethical violations. She's been operating illegally for the past 6 months. Sarah sank back into her chair, all fight drained out of her. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We were going to pay everything back once the inheritance was settled. We weren't trying to hurt anyone. Pay it back with what money? I asked. You were planning to steal my inheritance to cover the money you stole from Grandma Helen. How exactly does that make anything right? For the first time in my life, Sarah had no answer. No clever manipulation, no way to make herself the victim, no strategy for shifting blame to someone else. She just sat there exposed and defeated. But Grandpa Robert wasn't finished. He reached into his wheelchair bag and pulled out a leather portfolio that I recognized as belonging to Grandma Helen. Robert, he said, addressing the attorney, I need you to witness something important. He opened the portfolio and withdrew a legal document with multiple official seals and signatures. This is Helen's actual final will and testament, properly witnessed and notarized just 6 weeks before her death. The document Thomas has been working with is over a year old and has been superseded by this one. Mr. Davidson accepted the document with trembling hands. As he read, his eyebrows rose higher and higher. This will leave the bulk of the estate to Ava Matthews, with specific provisions for protecting the inheritance from family interference. It also includes detailed instructions for handling any challenges or attempts at manipulation. How much? I whispered, afraid to hope. Grandpa Robert smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. Helen's estate is worth considerably more than $3 million. Including her business investments, real estate holdings, and various accounts that she kept private, the total value approaches $22 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $22 million? How was that possible? Grandma Helen had lived so modestly, driving an older car, shopping at discount stores, never displaying any signs of wealth. Your grandmother was a very savvy businesswoman, Grandpa Robert explained. Helen's kitchen was much more profitable than anyone realized, and she invested wisely for decades. She also inherited some valuable property from her own parents that has appreciated significantly over the years. Dad looked like he was going to faint. $22 million? That's impossible. The business is only worth maybe $500,000. The catering business is actually a subsidiary of Helen's Kitchen Enterprises, which holds contracts with 3 major corporations and 2 government agencies, Grandpa Robert said. She also owns commercial real estate in 4 states and has a diversified investment portfolio that she managed herself. I thought about all the times Grandma Helen had quietly asked about my job, my finances, my dreams for the future. She had been assessing my character, making sure I could handle the responsibility she was planning to give me. And apparently I had passed a test I didn't even know I was taking. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Grandpa Robert looked directly at me with eyes that sparkled with something that looked almost like mischief. Ava, there's one more thing you need to know. Your grandmother didn't just leave you money. She's been secretly helping you for years. The silence in the conference room was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat as Grandpa Robert prepared to deliver what I sensed would be the most shocking revelation yet. His transformation from frail widower to sharp strategist had already upended everything I thought I knew about my family, but the gleam in his eyes suggested the biggest surprises were still coming. "Ava," he said gently, "do you remember when your student loans were mysteriously paid off 3 years ago? The letter you received said there had been an error in calculating your payments, and that you had actually qualified for a forgiveness program." I nodded slowly. It had seemed too good to be true at the time, $37,000 in debt just vanishing, but the paperwork had looked official, and I had been too relieved to question it deeply. That was Helen. She paid them off anonymously through a scholarship foundation she established. She's been watching you struggle and quietly helping without you knowing. My legs felt weak. Grandma Helen had been secretly supporting me while I thought I was entirely alone in the world. "The job at Morrison Marketing," Grandpa Robert continued. "Do you remember how surprised you were to get an interview? Your resume was good, but there were more qualified candidates." Helen was friends with Janet Morrison from their church. She didn't ask Janet to hire you, but she did mention that her granddaughter was looking for work and was someone with strong character and work ethic. Janet made her own decision, but Helen opened that door. Each revelation hit me like a wave. "What else?" "The apartment complex where you live, Riverside Gardens, Helen owns it. She's been your landlord for 3 years, making sure your rent stays affordable and that maintenance requests get handled promptly. She never raised your rent because she wanted you to be able to save money." I thought about Mr. Peterson, the property manager, who had always been unusually helpful and understanding. How many times had I wondered why he was so accommodating compared to horror stories I heard from friends about their landlords? "When you were laid off 2 years ago," Grandpa Robert said, "and you were worried about making ends meet, do you remember getting that freelance marketing project that paid exactly enough to cover your expenses until you found another job? The nonprofit project for animal rescue organizations? Helen created that project specifically for you. She hired you through an intermediary to design marketing materials for charities she supported. You did excellent work, but the timing wasn't a coincidence." I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized that my grandmother had been my guardian angel for years, protecting me from poverty and hardship, while never letting me know she was helping. She had let me maintain my independence and self-respect, while quietly ensuring I never fell too far. "But why keep it secret?" I whispered. "Because she wanted to see who you really were when you thought no one was watching," Grandpa Robert explained. "She wanted to know if you would remain kind and hardworking and honest even when life was difficult. And you did. Every test life threw at you, you handled with grace." Sarah chose that moment to explode. "This is completely unfair. Grandma Helen was playing favorites just like you're accusing Mom and Dad of doing. Where was my secret help? Where were my anonymous payments and convenient job opportunities?" Grandpa Robert looked at her with something approaching pity. "Sarah Helen helped you too. Remember the down payment for your first house? The $20,000 you thought came from your parents? That was Helen's money. The car loan they co-signed when you had no credit, Helen was the actual guarantor. The credit card debt they paid off when you were 25, Helen provided that money too. But she knew I needed help. She knew I was struggling. The difference," I said quietly, "is that your struggles came from choices. Gambling, overspending, lying about your income. My struggles came from working hard and still not having enough opportunities." Sarah's face turned red with rage. "You think you're so much better than me. You think you deserve everything while I deserve nothing. This is exactly the kind of self-righteous attitude that makes everyone tired of dealing with you." The attack was so vicious and so familiar that for a moment I almost fell back into my old pattern of apologizing and backing down. But surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal and my grandmother's love, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. No, Sarah. I think I deserved basic fairness and respect from my family. I think I deserved not to be stolen from and lied to and manipulated. I think I deserved parents who didn't actively sabotage my life while supporting yours." Mom jumped in, her voice shrill with desperation. "Ava, that's enough. You're being dramatic and hurtful. We've always loved you and supported you. Just because Helen decided to play games with her money doesn't mean we haven't been good parents to you." Good parents. The words came out louder than I intended. Good parents don't steal money from their daughter's grandmother. Good parents don't plan to exclude their child from an inheritance to cover their own crimes. Good parents don't tell their child she's not responsible enough to deserve family support, while secretly funding their other child's every mistake. The mask had come off completely now. Mom's face was twisted with fury as she stood up and pointed her finger at me accusingly. "You want to know the truth, Ava Fine. The truth is that you've been difficult and demanding your entire life. You've always expected things to be handed to you without earning them. Sarah works hard for everything she gets, but you just sit around feeling sorry for yourself and blaming everyone else for your problems." The words were so opposite to reality that they took my breath away. But before I could respond, Grandpa Robert stood up, fully no longer pretending to need his wheelchair for support. "Patricia," he said in a voice that commanded attention, "you need to stop talking before you say something that makes your legal situation even worse than it already is." Legal situation. Dad spoke for the first time in several minutes. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat. "Based on the evidence presented today, there are grounds for criminal charges against all three of you: theft, fraud, elder abuse, and potentially other crimes. The district attorney's office will need to review these documents." The reality of their situation seemed to hit them all at once. This wasn't just about losing an inheritance anymore. They were potentially facing prison time. Grandpa Robert reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a cashier's check. "Ava, this represents the liquid assets Helen wanted you to have immediately. $22 million is being transferred to a trust fund in your name, but she wanted you to have this amount available right away." He handed me the check and I stared at the number written in careful script, $22 million. More money than I had ever imagined possessing, more security than I had ever dreamed of having. But more important than the money was what it represented. My grandmother had seen my worth when my own parents couldn't. She had recognized my character and integrity and had chosen to reward it. For the first time in my life, I felt truly valued by someone who mattered. Sarah made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. "Ava, please, we're still family. Don't let money tear us apart. Surely we can find a way to work this out that's fair to everyone." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not my sister, but a stranger who had been pretending to care about me while actively working against my interests for my entire life. "Fair to everyone," I said calmly. "You mean fair the way it was when you planned to steal my entire inheritance. Fair the way it was when you forged Grandma Helen's signature to cover your gambling debts. That kind of fairness." She had no answer. None of them did. They sat in that conference room exposed as thieves and manipulators, while I held a check that represented not just financial security, but validation that someone had truly seen and appreciated who I was. Grandpa Robert smiled at me with pure love and pride. "Your grandmother always said you had a strength that others couldn't see." She was right. 6 months after that devastating day in Mr. Davidson's conference room, I stood in the marble foyer of what had once been Grandma Helen's house and was now my home. The transformation had been remarkable, but the real changes had happened inside me, not just in the decor and furnishings. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once the evidence was presented to the district attorney's office. Dad faced charges of elder abuse, theft, and fraud for his unauthorized access to Helen's accounts. Mom was charged with receiving stolen property and conspiracy for her role in selling Helen's belongings. Sarah's charges were the most serious wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and operating a fraudulent business scheme. The preliminary hearings had been devastating for them, but liberating for me. Watching them in handcuffs led away by bailiffs, I felt not satisfaction but a profound sense of closure. The people who had made me question my worth for 28 years were finally being held accountable for their actions. Sarah had tried one final manipulation, calling me from jail to beg for help with bail money. "Ava, please, I'm your sister. You can afford it now. Just this once, help me out, and I promise I'll pay you back." The old Ava might have considered it, might have felt guilty for having so much while Sarah had nothing, but the new Ava, armed with knowledge of exactly who my family really was, had a simple response. "Sarah, you've had decades of help that you never earned. It's time for you to face the consequences of your choices alone." I had hung up without another word, and for the first time in my life felt completely at peace with setting a firm boundary. The business side of my inheritance had been the biggest surprise. Helen's Kitchen Enterprises was far more sophisticated than I had imagined. The company held contracts with major corporations for their employee dining services, catered events for government agencies, and had licensing deals that generated passive income streams I was still learning about. Taking over as CEO had been intimidating at first, but my marketing background proved invaluable. I understood how to analyze customer data, develop brand strategies, and create systems for growth. More importantly, I shared Helen's values of treating employees fairly and providing quality service. My first major decision was to implement profit sharing for all employees who had been with the company for more than a year. Helen's records showed that many of the kitchen staff and drivers had been working for her for decades, earning modest wages while she accumulated millions. It felt right to share the success with the people who had helped create it. The second change was establishing an education fund for employees' children. Having struggled to pay for my own college education, I understood how transformative that kind of support could be. Within 3 months, 12 employees had applied for assistance with their children's tuition, and watching their gratitude reminded me why this inheritance was about more than just money. Grandpa Robert had moved into the guest house on the property, and his health had improved dramatically once he was free from the stress of watching his family's dysfunction unfold. It turned out that much of his apparent frailty had been grief and worry, not irreversible physical decline. "You know," he said one evening as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, "Helen always believed that money was a tool, not a goal. She wanted to see what you would do with that tool. What would she think of the changes I've made? She'd be proud. You're using your inheritance the way she would have to create opportunities for other people to build something meaningful." He paused. "But she'd be most proud of how you've handled your family." My family's attempts at reconciliation had been predictable and pathetic. Dad had written letters from jail claiming he had been temporarily confused by grief and asking me to remember all the good times we shared as a family. The good times he referenced were largely fictional family vacations. I hadn't been included in celebrations that had focused entirely on Sarah's achievements, holidays, where I had been treated like an unwelcome guest. Mom had tried a different approach, enlisting various relatives to call me and suggest that family should forgive family and that holding grudges was unhealthy. The relatives making these calls were the same ones who had ignored my existence for decades while showering Sarah with attention and gifts. Their sudden concern for family unity was transparently motivated by their hope that I might be generous with my new wealth. The most laughable attempt at manipulation came from Sarah herself, who hired a lawyer to contest the will on grounds that Helen had been mentally incompetent when she changed her estate plan. The lawsuit fell apart immediately when Mr. Davidson presented the medical records showing that Helen had been declared mentally competent by 3 different doctors right up until her stroke. Sarah's lawyer had withdrawn from the case when it became clear that not only was the lawsuit frivolous, but that Sarah couldn't pay his fees. She was currently serving 18 months in minimum security prison and would be facing additional civil lawsuits from the people she had defrauded in her fake real estate schemes. But the real transformation wasn't in my bank account or business portfolio, it was in how I saw myself. For the first time in my life, I understood that my worth wasn't determined by other people's approval or acceptance. Helen had seen my value when I couldn't see it myself, and her recognition had given me permission to value myself. I had started dating Marcus, an accountant who worked with one of my business contractors. He was kind, intelligent, and genuine qualities I had learned to prioritize after a lifetime of dealing with manipulative family members. When I told him about my inheritance and the family drama surrounding it, his response was simple. "I'm sorry they treated you that way, but I'm glad you're free from them now." No attempts to benefit from my wealth, no suggestions about how I should handle my relationships with my family, no judgment about my decisions. Just support and understanding. It was the kind of response I had spent 28 years hoping to get from my parents and never receiving. The legal proceedings were finally winding down. Dad and Mom had accepted plea deals that would result in restitution payments and minimal jail time, primarily because the money they had stolen was being repaid and they were first-time offenders. Sarah's case was more complex because her crimes had involved multiple victims, but her lawyer was negotiating a plea that would avoid a lengthy trial. Standing in my beautiful home surrounded by Helen's art and furniture and memories, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me here. The pain of discovering my family's betrayal had been terrible, but it had also been liberating. I no longer had to wonder why I never felt loved or valued by them. I knew the truth, and the truth had set me free. Grandpa Robert joined me in the foyer, looking healthier and happier than I had seen him in years. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Tomorrow was the day I would announce the Helen Matthews Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting young women who were working to build better lives despite challenging family circumstances. The foundation would provide scholarships, mentorship, and emergency financial assistance to women who demonstrated the same qualities Helen had valued in me: integrity, perseverance, and kindness. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in my life, I truly was. 1 year after that life-changing meeting in Mr. Davidson's conference room, I stood before an audience of 200 employees, community leaders, and local business owners in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel. The Helen Matthews Foundation was hosting its first annual scholarship gala, and I was about to deliver the keynote address about second chances and the power of believing in people others had overlooked. The transformation in my life had been profound, but more importantly, it had been purposeful. Every decision I had made with my inheritance had been guided by a simple question: what would Helen want me to do with this opportunity? The foundation had already awarded scholarships to 37 young women, funded a job training program at the local community college, and established an emergency assistance fund that had helped dozens of families avoid eviction or bankruptcy during temporary financial crises. But tonight was special because it marked the completion of our biggest project yet, the Helen Matthews Community Center, which would provide free career counseling, financial literacy classes, and childcare services to women working to improve their circumstances. As I looked out at the audience, I spotted several familiar faces. Marcus sat at our table near the front, his steady presence a reminder of how healthy relationships were supposed to feel. He had proposed 6 months ago with a simple, heartfelt speech about wanting to build a life with someone who understood the difference between love and manipulation. Our wedding was planned for next spring in the garden behind my house, where Helen's roses would be in full bloom. Grandpa Robert, now 83 and thriving, sat in the front row beaming with pride. His health had continued to improve over the past year, and he had become my most trusted advisor in running both the business and the foundation. More than that, he had become the father figure I had never had, someone who offered unconditional support while challenging me to grow and learn. Janet Morrison, my former boss, who had become a genuine friend, was at a table with several other business owners who had become foundation supporters. She had confessed months ago that Helen had indeed mentioned me when I applied for the marketing position, but that the decision to hire me had been based entirely on my qualifications and interview performance. Helen had simply opened a door. I had walked through it on my own merit. Even some members of my extended family were present, though their attendance represented a complex mix of genuine reconciliation and opportunistic social climbing. My cousin Lisa, who had genuinely reached out with no agenda other than repairing our relationship, was there with her husband. But so were Uncle Mark and Aunt Susan, who had suddenly remembered they had a niece after ignoring me for 30 years. The most meaningful faces in the audience, though, belonged to the scholarship recipients and program participants. Women like Jennifer, a single mother who had used foundation support to complete her nursing degree and was now working in pediatric care. Maria, who had escaped an abusive marriage with help from our emergency fund and was starting her own catering business. Ashley, whose scholarship had allowed her to study engineering while supporting her disabled veteran father. These women reminded me every day why Helen's legacy mattered. She hadn't just left me money. She had given me the tools to transform other lives the way she had transformed mine. As for my immediate family, the year had brought both justice and a strange kind of peace. Dad had served 4 months in minimum security prison and was now living in a small apartment working as a bookkeeper for a local charity. The experience had genuinely humbled him, and while our relationship would never be what it should have been, he had stopped making excuses and had begun acknowledging the harm he had caused. We exchanged brief, polite messages on holidays, but neither of us pushed for more. Mom had received a suspended sentence and community service in exchange for her cooperation in recovering stolen items and testifying about the extent of the family's financial crimes. She had undergone court-ordered therapy, which seemed to have helped her recognize the damage her favoritism had caused. She sent me a letter every few months, usually updates about her volunteer work at a senior center. The letters were stilted and careful, but they represented an effort I chose to acknowledge without necessarily reciprocating. Sarah had served her full sentence and was now working as a receptionist at a medical clinic while living in a supervised halfway house. Her real estate license had been permanently revoked, and she would never again be able to work in financial services. The last I heard, she was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings and had enrolled in community college courses to train as a medical assistant. She had written me one letter from prison, not asking for money or favors, but apologizing for the years of manipulation and cruelty. The letter was probably part of some rehabilitation program, but it felt genuine in a way her previous communications never had. I had written back once, wishing her success in building an honest life, but making clear that I wasn't interested in resuming a relationship. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, and some people had to earn redemption through actions, not words. The legal proceedings had concluded with full restitution of stolen funds, though the amounts involved were relatively small compared to my total inheritance. More importantly, the criminal convictions had sent a clear message that elder abuse and financial crimes would be prosecuted regardless of family relationships. Helen's Kitchen Enterprises had flourished under my leadership. We had expanded into 3 new markets, launched a line of prepared foods for grocery stores, and partnered with local farms to create a sustainable supply chain that supported the regional economy. The company now employed over 300 people and had been recognized as one of the best employers in the state. But business success, while satisfying, wasn't the most important change in my life. The real transformation was internal. I no longer questioned my worth or sought validation from people who were incapable of providing it. I had learned to recognize genuine care and support, to build boundaries that protected my well-being, and to trust my own judgment about people and situations. The therapy I had started shortly after the inheritance meeting had helped me understand how 28 years of manipulation and emotional abuse had shaped my responses to relationships and conflict. Learning to identify and interrupt old patterns of self-doubt and people-pleasing had been challenging but liberating work. Most importantly, I had learned that family isn't determined by DNA, but by love, respect, and mutual support. Grandpa Robert was more of a parent to me than the people who had raised me. Marcus was more of a partner than any romantic relationship I had attempted while still seeking approval from people who didn't value me. The women I mentored through the foundation were more like sisters than Sarah had ever been. As I began my speech that evening, I looked out at the faces of people who had chosen to support the Foundation's mission, and I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from using privilege and resources to create opportunities for others. My grandmother, Helen Matthews, used to say that money was like seeds, I began. You could hoard them and watch them rot, or you could plant them and watch them grow into something beautiful that feeds many people. Tonight, we celebrate the harvest from seeds she planted through her belief in the power of recognizing and nurturing potential that others might overlook. The audience was attentive as I shared some of the Foundation's success stories, but the real message was deeper than individual achievements. It was about the ripple effects of treating people with dignity and providing support without judgment or strings attached. Helen taught me that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or businesses, I continued. It's the knowledge that someone believes in your worth even when others don't see it. That validation gives you permission to believe in yourself, and that self-belief becomes the foundation for everything else you accomplish. I talked about the importance of recognizing manipulation and abuse, about learning to set boundaries with people who claim to love you but consistently treat you poorly, about finding the courage to walk away from relationships that diminish rather than enhance your life. But I also emphasized hope and resilience. If you're someone who has been overlooked or undervalued by people who should have protected and supported you, please know that their inability to see your worth says nothing about who you are and everything about who they are. Your value isn't determined by their approval. As the evening concluded with the announcement of new scholarship recipients, I felt Helen's presence strongly. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the knowledge that I was living according to the values she had demonstrated throughout her life. She had built something meaningful through hard work and integrity, and she had passed that opportunity to someone she trusted to continue the legacy. Walking home that night with Marcus and Grandpa Robert past the gardens Helen had loved, and through the neighborhood where she had raised her family and built her business, I felt complete in a way I had never experienced before. The little girl who had spent decades trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it had finally learned that she had always been worthy of love. She just had to stop looking for it in the wrong places. Helen would be proud, Grandpa Robert said as we reached the front door. I think she knew, I replied. I think she always knew who I could become if I had the right support and opportunities. She just had to wait for the right moment to provide them. The inheritance had given me financial security, business ownership, and the resources to help others, but the real gift had been permission to value myself. Helen had seen my character when I couldn't see it myself, and her recognition had given me the foundation to build a life based on my own worth rather than other people's approval. As I write this story for you today, I hope it reminds you that your value isn't determined by how others treat you. You deserve relationships built on respect and genuine care. You deserve people in your life who celebrate your successes and support you through challenges. And if the people who claim to love you don't provide those things, you have every right to seek that support elsewhere. Sometimes the family we create is more important than the family we're born into. Sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the most loving thing we can do for ourselves. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone comes along who sees our worth even when we can't see it ourselves and gives us permission to believe in our own value. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace with difficult family members and standing up for yourself? Have you found people who genuinely support your growth and happiness? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If it resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with anyone who might need to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and finding your own worth. I wish you the strength to recognize your value and the wisdom to surround yourself with people who see it too.